Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm filming a book unhaul. So during this quarantine I've been reading as much as I can, but I realized that even with all this time on my hands, I'm not getting through tons of books, which is fine. It's not my intention to burn through books without actually enjoying them. So I took some time to pick out some things that I don't think I need anymore. Some of these books I have read and some of these books I haven't read. So I don't really have a lot of books to get rid of. Usually I'm pretty sure in what books I take in after I read a book, and if I don't like it I usually just get rid of it right away, but I haven't gone to the bookstore in forever. So I have some books here that I haven't read, and unfortunately I don't picture myself ever picking any of these books up with the exception of one before anything else on my shelves that I haven't read. And I do have some books that I have read and I didn't like enough to keep, or I really actively just didn't like. Some books here I thought were fine, but I don't need them on my shelves. I can't give these to anyone that's interested in them. I'm just going to give them to a secondhand bookstore, and the books that they don't take I will give to a Goodwill. So I'll start with the biggest stack of books that I have, and I'll talk about it in one go. I have a lot of James Patterson books that I have not read. I'm not going to carry the whole stack. I'm just going to hold on to one. I have so many James Patterson books. I used to love reading his books when I was 12, 13, anything from his middle grade stuff. I used to read a lot of his mystery thrillers as well as his middle grade stuff when I was really young, and at the time when I was reading his more adult stuff I felt like I was so mature because I was reading some adult content stuff. But as I grew up I realized that his writing is not great. It's not bad. I think it's pretty average. I think James Patterson, at least some of his adult stuff, is kind of some of the stuff that you might read in a doctor's office while you're waiting to be seen. It's not a book that you are, and just at least for me, it's not. His books are kind of something that I read to pass the time, something to buff my Goodreads end of the year goal. So yeah, I have no interest to read most of his stuff. I have some of his older stuff that was either adapted into films or TV shows that I'm still interested in, but for the most part anything from his Andrew Cross universe or his Women's Murder Club I'm not super interested in, because I feel like the plot's probably something super generic that I've read before, and I have a lot of mystery thriller books that on my shelves that I haven't touched that I'm way more interested in. So with that, I'm getting rid of Sale by James Patterson and Howard Rogan, Don't Blink by James Patterson and Howard Rogan, Judge and Jury by James Patterson and Andrew Gross, Seventh Heaven by James Patterson and Maxine Petro, Cross Country by James Patterson, Fifth Horseman by James Patterson and Maxine Petro, 4th of July by James Patterson and Maxine Petro. So the next two books I got from a subscription service that deals with horror, thriller, kind of suspense type books. A lot of those books were hit and miss for me in terms of the plot. These two I have absolutely no interest in reading. Some of the elements sound kind of interesting to me. I don't think I'll ever pick them up. The first book is The Winter Family by Clifford Jackman. This is set I think a few years after the Civil War. It follows some Union soldiers that have I think become some sort of rebels or some kind of bandit group. So I do love historical fiction, but the Civil War is a period that I don't really like reading about. It's just not my cup of tea. It's not something that I really enjoy. So this doesn't call out to me. It kind of sounds like a Western as well. That's definitely not something that I'm interested in. So yeah, getting rid of this. Never heard about it. Never heard anyone talk about it. So this next book I've never heard anyone else talk about, and it's Wraith by Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens. So this is a horror suspense thriller novel. I'm not totally sure about the plot of this book. The only thing I really got from the synopsis was that ghosts have been weaponized, which sounds strange because it is. I have no interest in reading something like that. So the plot sounds kind of weird. It sounds like a really bad horror film, which I do like bad horror films, but I'd rather watch them than read about them. I've never heard about the authors, and I have no problem letting this go. So the next book is the one that I actually do want to read. I just don't want this particular copy on my shelves, and that is The Girl Who Played with Fire by Stieg Larsson. This is either the second or the third book in his Millennium trilogy, the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo stuff. I really like the American film. I haven't seen the foreign films, but yeah, I actually do want to read the series. I just don't want this mass market super chunky book on my shelves. So this next book is actually from a really early Owl Crate, I believe, and that is Everything That Makes You by Maura McStay. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is from a really early Owl Crate. So this book follows a young girl named Fiona, and it follows two timelines, where in one timeline she had a huge accident, and I think it scarred her face, and that's affected how she makes relationships and the presence that she has in her school. And then the other timeline is about Fiona, where she's like this lacrosse star, and I think she has like scholarships, and I think her like best friend's in love with her. It's a contemporary novel, so I typically don't read contemporary, and when I do, I usually try to pick up like more hard-hitting stuff. This book kind of sounds like a more coming of age story, which is not something that I'm really into right now, so I have no interest in reading this. So the next book that I'm getting rid of is called 13 Tales of Horror by 13 Masters of Horror, with a lot of authors, and it's edited by T. Pines. I don't usually read short story collections, and when I do, it's either by an author I'm familiar with or a subject that I'm really interested in. This book tells me nothing about what kind of horror is in here. I'm just not really interested in this, and it's really old, so I think it's pretty dated, and some of the stories might be pretty dated as well. And the only author that I'm familiar with from this list is R.L. Stine. So now I'm getting into the books that I have read that I don't want on my shelves anymore. And the first book that I have is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This is probably one of the most loved books in this video, and I enjoyed this. I thought it was fine for what it was. So this book is about a professor, and he's not necessarily like a failure at life, but he definitely had the opportunity to do more with what he had. And this book revolves around like alternate timelines, like alternate universes. So I think I read this book in pretty much one sitting. I thought it was really attention grabbing. I wasn't really drawn to any of the characters here. I thought they were all pretty bland. The story itself was like really interesting, don't get me wrong. I didn't really have a huge like emotional connection to the story. I thought it was cool for what it was, but yeah, I don't really need this on my shelves, and I don't plan on ever rereading it, and it's not a book that I'd hype up to you all. It's fine, a lot of people love it, but I just thought it was okay. So the next book I have is Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. This is a really well-loved kind of magical book about witches ish. It's about these two young women who grew up in a household raised by their aunts, and their aunts have this reputation of being witches, and their aunts kind of like hype up this rumor. They don't really mind being called witches, but that does affect these young girls' childhood. They're not really well liked, and they're kind of like ignored for the most part. So this book didn't really have like a straightforward plot. It was a lot of meandering, which is fine. I just wasn't in love with this book. I would have much rather read about these young girls' childhood with their like witchy aunts than as an adult, because they basically tried to become like the most suburban versions of themselves. At least one of them did. The other one was kind of like a wild child. But eventually she herself wanted to like settle down and have like a nice life. And I thought for the most part, at least the beginning of this book, I thought there's like no kind of magical elements. I thought it was just, you know, coincidental kind of like magical-ish. But then something happens during the middle of the book where I was like, okay, so this definitely has like magical elements, but I'm not a huge fan of that kind of like in between. Like if I'm gonna get fantasy, I really would rather just have a fantasy novel as opposed to something that's kind of like fantasy-ish. So yeah, I only read this book because I wanted to watch the film, and I still haven't even watched the film, so that kind of sucks. I think it was fine. Some people really like this book. Some people think it's also kind of like middle of the road like myself, but it's definitely not a bad book. I can see where this author's writing could have definitely stuck with people. I think it's really pretty, but a pretty book does not make for me, so I'm getting rid of this. So this next book I have is a coming-of-age novel that I've had on my shelves forever, and that is The Girl's Guide to Hunting and Fishing by Melissa Bank. So I actually found this like at a Goodwill, and when I do go into like a Goodwill store, like a thrift store, I kind of lower my expectations, and I'm not really looking for anything in particular since they usually don't have like a set like stock on hand. So whatever I find that looks even mildly interesting, I'll pick it up. And I probably picked it up because it talks about the state of being female in the late 20th century America. That's like one of the quotes in the back, and it kind of is, but it's also kind of very the life of a woman from like upper middle white class, which isn't always relatable, especially to me and to a lot of other people. So yeah, this is also another book that kind of meanders. There's not like a set plot. The only overall like arching thing is that this woman, as she grows up, she has a relationship with like an older man, and that's something that was like a huge part of this book, and I thought it was fine. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I read a lot of these books and I thought they were fine, but they're not something that I want to keep, and this is one of them. I feel like this is a book that a lot of women might read like at like a wine book club type thing. I have no urge to talk about this book. So this next book that I have, I did enjoy, and I read it pretty quickly in almost one sitting, and that is The Girls by Emma Cline. This is also a coming of age novel. It's set during like the 60s and 70s. This book is about a young woman who finds herself in a group of people that is essentially a cult. Eventually something happens, but for the most part this is a coming of age novel. I thought this was well written. I can see the talent in the author. I will say that the beginning was like getting hit in the head with like a thesaurus. So coming of age novels for me are a little hit and miss. Like if I don't at least somewhat relate to like the characters' upbringing, then like I don't really connect to the book at all. I thought the book, like, don't get me wrong, I know the book is good, but she obviously went through some things that I never went through, and while it was entertaining to read, I also don't feel the need to reread this. It didn't leave that much of an impact on me. So the next book is something that I've recently talked about in my like last wrap up, and that is The Land of Stories, The Wishing Spell by Chris Colfer. So this is a fantasy reimagining where this set of twins falls into a storybook, and they spend the entire book trying to get back home by trying to collect these ingredients for a spell. I actually DNF'd this because I thought the reimagining element of this book wasn't that much of a reimagining. The characters that we know are pretty much the same as what we're familiar with. I thought the writing itself was really anticlimactic because every time the characters had a problem, they had it solved within the next paragraph or so. You should definitely watch my wrap up for like more thoughts on this book. But yeah, don't need this. It makes me really sad. I really need more middle grade in my life, but I definitely don't need this in my life. So the next book I'm getting rid of is The Scary Stories Treasury by Alvin Schwartz. This combines like all three of the scary stories to tell in the dark, like middle grade horror novels. I actually reread this to watch the film, but I thought these stories were okay. I know I'm not like the intended audience, but I thought some of these stories were kind of repetitive in terms of like what the twist was. Some of these stories in here were also like formatted in a way where you tell the story and then tells you like when to like jump scare your friends, and that's how the story ends, which is like fine, you know, for like a kid, but I also don't need this in my life. The best part of this book is probably the illustrations. They're terrifying, but they're kind of iconic. I vividly remember like all the illustrations. Yeah, the stories are kind of lackluster. There's probably like a handful that I remember that I thought really stood out, but for the most part they're repetitive or they're boring. The next book I have is a really disappointing unhaul for me, and that is The Last Namsara by Kristen Cicerelli. This book is about a young woman whose father is like the king or the emperor, and he tells her to kill this dragon, and once she kills this dragon she will gain his respect and the respect of the kingdom. Something happened prior to the events of this novel where she's looked down upon despite her being someone of a higher class. A lot of people really don't like her, but she thinks this is a great opportunity to like prove herself to her father and to everyone else. There's also a arranged marriage plot here that I thought would be handled differently than it was, and it was kind of disappointing. I think there was so much potential for this book to stand out amongst the other kind of like magical, medieval, elvish, kingdom, political type books that we have right now in YA fantasy, and this is very different from that. It kind of got smothered with very like basic YA tropes. The only thing I really liked was the art of storytelling. It has a huge part in this book, and I really enjoyed those parts. I thought they were well written. I really liked the main character, and the love interest that she had was so bland. I didn't even notice that he was going to be the main love interest when he was introduced. I am interested to see how the story goes on. I might pick up the audiobook if I ever have access to it, but right now I don't care about the story, and it takes up a lot of space on my shelves, so I'm gonna get rid of it. The next book I have is kind of disappointing because I know how much people enjoy it, and that is The Golden Compass, the first book in his Dark Material series by Philip Pullman. So the story follows a young girl named Lyra who lives in this like alternate version of our world with like these like demon creatures, and she goes on an adventure to the Arctic to find her best friend and her uncle who's been captured by some people. That's pretty much the general plot. The first parts of this book I was really confused. I felt like I had missed some sort of like prequel novel that I was supposed to read before this. I really couldn't wrap my head around what was going on. I felt like I was missing some important elements. I felt like some things weren't explained. It kind of embarrasses me that this is meant for children, or at least younger people, and I'm 23 when I read it, and I was confused by so much that was going on. I didn't understand. I feel bad not liking this book because I know it means a lot to a lot of people. For some people, this was like their Harry Potter like moment, and I didn't go into it expecting it to be that for me, but I expected more just because so many people loved it. I guess this is why I don't usually go into books with high expectations. This is probably one of the few books that I did go into expecting a lot. Maybe the second and third book gets better, but I really didn't enjoy this that much. It was a good book. I can recognize why so many people love it, but I personally didn't feel any attachment to the story, and I thought some parts were kind of dull for me. And the last book that I'm going to talk about was something that I read for my owls, which is still going on. So I finished this really recently, and that is Shiver by Maggie Stiefvater. This story is about a young woman named Grace who, when she was younger, was attacked by a group of wolves. And since then, she's always felt like she had some sort of like connection to them. She actually feels like she has this really like deep, profound connection to one particular wolf, and this one wolf is actually a werewolf who also feels like he has a connection to her. So we have like a romance story between a girl and this werewolf. Maggie Stiefvater is like an author that I really want to get into because I know so many people like her books, but I think she's just not for me. I've read The Raven Boys and I thought that was okay. I gave the first book like 3 stars. I gave this book also 3 stars, but I think I want to like lower it. It just wasn't for me. Maggie Stiefvater's writing, I think some people like it because it's kind of like this magical whimsy type feel sometimes, but for me it kind of gets a little annoying, especially when she has like metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. At least in this book it felt like there was always something that she was comparing to like the stars or the moon. And I remember there's this one metaphor that was like, my life was like a foggy window pane glass before I met him or something, and it was just kind of like, can you relax for like 5 seconds? You like just met him. Both of the main characters in this book were kind of bland and boring and generic. I love werewolves, but this was kind of boring. The only thing I was really interested in was one particular character who was like the like father figure, like head werewolf in this group, and how the werewolves work, like their biology. I would have liked a book more centered on the werewolves as opposed to like the romance. There's also some moments of like animal violence and like animal cruelty, which I didn't know going in, but I thought I should mention because I know that's something that bothers a lot of people. It kind of bothers me sometimes. I remember like skim reading some of the more romance heavy parts because I thought it was just kind of ridiculous how these characters kind of became like an item, like a relationship, before they actually started getting to know each other, before they actually started talking about themselves to each other. I think a lot of people really like this book. When it was published, I feel like I saw this book everywhere for a while. I definitely don't need it on my shelves. I'm not going to continue the story, and I hear it kind of gets bad in some parts. So yeah, that's all I'm getting rid of. I'm usually pretty good at like guessing which books I want to take in. I'm very rarely disappointed in a book unless I really don't like it, or I read it, don't need it on my shelves. So yeah, I can only hope that these books go to someone that will actually appreciate them, someone who will read them at least once, maybe more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.